Welcome to Proving the Point, where we discuss important research papers that you should know about. Today we're going to talk about this paper called Solutrean Hypothesis, Genetics, the Mammoth in the Room. And what this paper discusses is how the Americas first came to be populated. So we'll explain why it matters in a minute, but just to give you an overview of the conventional understanding, again, we're talking about how the Americas came to be populated for the first time. And the idea is that somewhere between 15 and 25,000 years ago, although those numbers are constantly changing as they learn more, populations from Eastern Asia were migrating up. And then at this time in history, the sea levels were much lower. It was during the Ice Age, so the sea levels were much lower, and there was a lot more ice. And what this did is it permitted a land bridge between Russia and Alaska. And so then the idea is that Eastern Asians migrated up through Northeast Russia, down through Alaska, down through Canada, and then into North America, and ultimately through Central and South America. But what this paper that we're going to look at discusses is the possibility that a population around the same time might have migrated from Europe into North America, from the eastern side of North America, and then might have made their way down. Okay, so those aren't mutually exclusive. So in other words, the current paper doesn't question that indeed Siberians did move from Eastern Asia into the Americas, but they suggest that in addition to that, there was a separate migration, probably around the same time, if not slightly earlier, from Western Europe into the Americas. Okay, so then the reason this paper matters should be obvious, but the topic of who the original Native Americans were and how they were treated after the modern wave of Europeans got here is very political. So, the idea on the left is that you had these Native Americans who were all from East Asia ultimately, living in the Americas peacefully for thousands of years in perfect harmony with nature until the evil European colonists arrived, and they came here and basically genocided all the Native Americans. And it's considered this great injustice against them, and it's used to argue that we don't actually have a rightful claim to this land. Okay, but if this paper that we're going to look at is true, and among the first waves into North America was from Europe, then we do have a rightful claim to this land. And the roles might be reversed. So obviously those Europeans are not here today, the original wave. And so what might have happened is they might have gotten here first, or at least around the same time. And then the Siberian Americans came in from the West and probably entered into conflict with those European Americans, the original wave, and might have displaced them. Okay. Regardless of whether all of that is true, it's important to point out that all those native, quote unquote, native tribes that were here, they were warring with each other well before we got here. And obviously, that very simple-minded view of how Native Americans were peaceful and in harmony with nature is not true. They were extremely violent. They were engaged in constant warfare. They were driving the megafauna that lived in this territory to extinction. So they were not these peaceful, environmentally harmless people. Okay? That's ultimately one of the main reasons it matters. Another reason that it matters is because there's a broader sort of revisionist view of white history, European history, that's taking place, and this kind of feeds into it a little bit. So as people are trying to reconstruct white history, you have this sort of alternative research paradigm in which Indo-Europeans originated somewhere around the north of the Black Sea, so about where Ukraine meets Russia. And then the idea is that they sort of migrated down south into what's now the Middle East and ultimately down into India. And they migrated over into Europe and North Africa. And as they went, they were basically spreading civilization. Okay. And the idea is often extended to say that they might have been responsible for creating many of the megalithic structures around the ancient world. So like, for example, Baalbek in Lebanon, where there's massive stone pillars and stone construction. Okay. Maybe even the pyramids. And again, the idea is that they were disseminating technological advancement throughout the area. And some people extend this idea to suggest that they might have migrated over into the Americas also. And it's not just North America. A combination of genetic evidence, as we'll talk about today, as well as archaeological similarities and cultural similarities and mythological similarities, and similarities in the symbols that they used. So like, for example, the swastika. It's an ancient Indo-European symbol that's been spread everywhere from India in the east all the way to the Americas. So native, quote unquote, Native Americans use this symbol also. So again, we're not here to speculate about all of that and whether all of that is true, but the point is this matters a lot for understanding the true nature of the history of Europeans. And if you don't want to take it that far, you can just say, this is important to understanding the movement of ancient people throughout the ancient world. Okay, so first we'll get into the paper. They explain what the Solutrean Hypothesis is. Again, it's the idea that the people living in North America, some of the ancient cultures found in North America, actually came originally from southwestern Europe during the last glacial maximum, which again, that was around 20,000 years ago or so. And this is in addition to the separate route through the Bering Land Bridge. So again, they're going to use the terms Solutrean and Bering Strait multiple times in this paper. The Bering Strait is the land bridge that connected eastern Russia to Alaska. Okay, the Solutrean route is basically the idea that the Solutrean culture, which existed in Western Europe, made their way into North America via the Atlantic. So they're saying that in addition to the Bering Land Strait, there was also this pathway across the Atlantic. And supporting that is genetic evidence, which we're going to look at extensively. Okay, so just to explain the DNA that they talk about, we don't need to get too far into it, but this stands for mitochondrial DNA. And what that refers to is DNA that comes specifically from your maternal lineage. So you got your mitochondrial DNA from your mom, she got that from her mom, she got that from her mom, and so on. So all the other DNA in your body, with the exception of your Y chromosomes if you're a male, that came from a combination of your two parents. And so what that means is that it's a product of the mixture of two individuals. So if you have two populations that merge or mix at all, then the rest of your DNA quickly becomes an admixture of the two populations, which makes it difficult to determine what group you came from. However, if we look at your mitochondrial DNA only, since that wasn't ever mixed between two individuals, it only came from your maternal lineage, it's easier to determine which population you belong to. So it represents a relatively uncontaminated source of information. All right, so to explain this X2A, what that's referring to is what's called the genetic haplogroup. And we don't need to get into too much detail because it becomes kind of difficult to explain. But basically, the mitochondrial DNA of every individual is not the same as every other individual, or else it wouldn't be valuable to use for genetic analysis. But different populations have experienced different mutations in their mitochondrial DNA over time that leads it to be different than every other population. So for example, the mitochondrial DNA of East Asians is discernibly different than the mitochondrial DNA of Europeans. And so what this means is that each individual person can basically be categorized into different what are called haplogroups, which is basically, is their mitochondrial DNA more aligned with the East Asians, or is it more aligned with the Europeans, or whatever other group you're looking at? And they give each haplogroup a different nomenclature. So, for example, there's haplogroup X, which is a cluster of people with a certain nature of their mitochondrial DNA, a certain sequence to it. And then within that, there are subcategories. So there's haplogroups X1 and haplogroup X2. Those are two different subpopulations that descended from the same common ancestor that had the broader X group. And then within each of those, there's subcategories. So there's haplogroup X2A, haplogroup X2B, and so on. So again, we don't need to get too technical with it, but what you need to understand here is that there's mitochondrial haplogroup X, which is basically mitochondrial DNA signature that is thought to have appeared around Eastern Europe, which we'll talk about. And then the idea is that, again, a population from there moved into North America by crossing the Atlantic, ultimately producing this variant population called haplogroup X2A. But when you see haplogroup X, just know that they're ultimately traced back to European origin. Okay. So what's the significance of this with respect to this paper? Well, the idea is that they found this genetic signature in a lot of quote unquote Native Americans. And so the idea is, well, maybe Europeans came over and they genetically intermixed with Native Americans. So we're going to talk about that in this paper and more. Okay, so they start off by giving an overview of how people have conventionally thought about the peopling of America. And again, they say it used to be a relatively simple model where Siberian hunters, that's Eastern Russia, basically followed large animals into North America and then disseminated down into Central and South America. Okay, but now that they were referred to as the Clovis culture. Okay, but now they say, well, we know now that there were people here before that. So that old model is outdated and they had to push it back further. And it's worth noting that they're pushing it back even further than that now. So this paper is from 2014. When I checked, it said currently people are considering anywhere from 15,000 to around 25,000, maybe even earlier than that. So the numbers vary wildly depending on what source you're looking at. But the point is there's a lot still to learn about the peopling of Americas, and it probably took place longer ago than we thought. Okay, but it says there were people here before Clovis, but it says it's still very contentious as to who those people were and where they came from. So they say that, again, they used to think it was Northeast Asia exclusively. Well, now they're proposing, and it has been proposed previously, that a different route, not just from Northeast Asia, but also across the Atlantic from southwestern Europe, occurred during the last glacial maximum, around 22,000 to 17,000 years before now. Okay. It says there are 4 major objections to this, and I'm going to add a 5th one. But they say, 1, the distance between the proposed origin point and the entry point, which the proposed origin point for this transatlantic migration is, like I said, around France, so right in this region. And they're thought to have migrated over into eastern Canada and landed around here. Okay, so he's saying one of the challenges is that that's a far distance. As we'll see, the proposed alternative is a much farther distance. So that's one objection. Another objection is the apparent difficulty of making that journey. So there was more, you got to keep in mind again, there was a lot more ice in this region during this time, which wouldn't have meant that this whole area is just open ocean. But still, the idea of the critics is that it would have been technically difficult to sail along that ice corridor over into Canada. So technically difficult. They say a time gap between the originating archaeological culture, Solutrean and Clovis. Again, Solutrean, that's a culture that existed in Europe. And Clovis is, like I said, what they initially thought was the first culture in America. So what they're saying here is that there's a time gap between the originating culture of the Solutrean culture and Clovis. Okay? And then the one that they focus on in this paper is the claimed lack of genetic evidence for this proposed founding population. In other words, what's the genetic evidence that Europeans came here a long time ago? And that's what they present in this paper. Okay, when I was researching for this video, I found another objection that's been raised, and that is that the Solutrean hypothesis is part of white supremacy. Okay, so note the author and his last name. It doesn't sound like a European to me. So it probably has a motive in undermining white history, but he doesn't actually talk about really any of the evidence for or against the Solutrean hypothesis. But he basically just says that a lot of white supremacists are gravitating toward this idea because it makes white history look better. Okay, which it does, but that's no reason to discount it. Okay, but one of the reasons that it's so controversial, again, is because people recognize, even people on the left, recognize that this paints European history in a more favorable light. And so they want to prevent that because, of course, they're anti-white. But then, like he says, he's going to focus mostly on the genetic evidence. These authors will. So we're going to skip most of this. He starts off by talking about some past archaeological evidence. We're not going to talk about everything in this paper, otherwise this video would take forever. So we're going to go right to sort of the main figure of this paper, which is what's really important. All right, so this is showing figure 1, which is, like I said, the most important figure of the paper. And what it's showing is 2 different haplogroups that are related to each other and their distribution on the planet. So you have haplogroup X2, which is like the ancestral haplogroup, that would eventually give rise to haplogroup X2A, which is being shown over here on the right side. And the darker the color in a region, basically the more concentrated and the more abundant people of that haplogroup are. So, for example, people who have this genetic signature of haplogroup X2, they're very concentrated here in modern day, like Turkey. Okay? But again, it's known for reasons that we can talk about later that this haplogroup is ancestral. In other words, it's older than haplogroup X2A, but it gave rise to haplogroup X2A. So if you look at haplogroup X2A, these are people who descended from the people over here. Well, they're all located over here in North America. So how did you get the progeny or the descendants of this group clear over here in North America? Well, there's kind of 2 models, which they're showing in these inlets in this figure. So up here, you have option A. And surprisingly, this is the one that mainstream academics accept, which is you had the ancestral individuals over here in like Turkey, and they basically migrated over the course of thousands of years throughout all of Asia, up through Siberia, down through Alaska, through most of Canada, all the way over here to eastern Canada. And you might be wondering, well, why don't you then see the genetic signature of these people throughout here? In other words, why is there no color in most of Asia or most of North America? And the answer that critics give is that, well, this haplogroup basically went extinct everywhere except where it started and where it ended. But this entire journey, anyone who had that haplogroup in that entire region, they went extinct. That doesn't seem likely. Okay, and that's what these authors really fixate on. It's like if they went if everybody here in North America got there because they went through the Bering Strait, you would expect genetic continuity all the way through. Okay, but you don't. You see a genetic signature in southeastern Europe, and then you see the offspring of that genetic signature over in eastern North America, and you don't see it anywhere in between, which is an anomaly. Okay, the alternative, which is what these authors suggest, is the Solutrean hypothesis, which is that this culture, these ancestors over here, at some point, they migrated across the Atlantic Ocean and made it to North America over here. And that's why there's genetic commonality there. That makes much more sense from a genetic perspective. Okay? So that's what these authors spend most of their time arguing about. Okay. So there's a few more important points to discuss with this paper. So first of all, again, it's important to point out that these authors, they don't question that there were people coming in from East Asia. Okay, they're suggesting that there was an additional, if not multiple, colonizations of North America. Okay, but they say that the critics of the Solutrean hypothesis often suggest that it's an either or. Either they came in through the Bering Strait or the Solutrean hypothesis is correct, and there can't be both. There can't be multiple migrations. Okay, so they go in through technical critiques of their hypothesis and they give their rebuttals. It's worth a read, but it gets pretty technical, so we're going to skip most of that. But again, they talk here about how, everybody agrees that for most of the people who came into North America, most of the founding populations that we know exist based on sequencing of ancient samples, they came from East Asia. Okay, but where they disagree is, as they say here, is that there's this 5th group the haplogroup X2A, which came from the West Eurasian haplogroup of X. And even though the timing has changed on this as we've learned more, it's worth pointing out the timeline of these migrations. So with the groups coming in that are admitted to have come from East Asia, they're thought to be around 14,000 years old. It says that this fifth group, this group coming in potentially from Europe, they might be older than that. So depending on the methodology used, they're either 14,000 or 21,000 years old. Okay, is when they first got to America. So they might be older than the ones coming in from East Asia. Okay, so again, we might have gotten there first. All right, they say here that, again, that X haplogroup, it originated near the Arabian Peninsula. The X2 branch of that originated in the Eastern Mediterranean. And they say it never made it past the Indus Valley. So in other words, it didn't make it to East Asia. So they didn't go that direction. Okay, what this figure here is showing is basically the timeline of the divergence of these haplogroups. So the higher up it is on this graph, the further back in time it is in thousands of years. So like this is 60,000 years ago. So haplogroup X was first thought to appear around 30,000 years ago. Again, that then split into various subpopulations, including haplogroup X2, thought to be around 22,000 years ago when that formed. That further diverged into haplogroups X2A, which is what this paper was talking about. That was then found in the Americas. The rest of this is found in West Eurasia, as we talked about. So notice that nowhere in this is it found in East Asia. There's no evidence that these people went that direction to get to America. Okay, they clearly went across the Atlantic. At least that's a straightforward interpretation of this. Okay. Next, they address the idea that there weren't boats available for this at this time period, but that doesn't hold water because there's plenty of evidence for sea travel very far back in history. So as far back as 49,000 years ago, which is well earlier than what we're talking about here. So there's no reason they couldn't have had boats to get there. It's not a technical challenge, or at least not a limitation. Okay, then they talk about other studies that give corroborating evidence for this. I think we can skip most of that, but again, the main point that they focus on here is that the haplogroup that they're talking about, X2A, that's uniquely found in ancient Native American samples in Eastern North America, okay, which is not what you'd expect if they came in from East Asia. It should be then in the Western part of North America, but it isn't. Okay, so there's various other pieces of evidence that corroborate all this. But like I said, we can kind of skip through most of that. And they say that there's been other observations of European DNA in Native American samples before, but that's typically been ignored. Okay, so it's not been well studied. Okay, so they continue to talk about other evidence supporting their idea. One interesting thing that they talk about here at the bottom is they reference a previous paper from other authors that looked at a Brazilian population, so native Brazilian population. And what they say is basically that Brazilian population had genetic signatures associated with the French. So again, this is consistent with the idea that Europeans at ancient times had come into the Americas and either preceded or intermixed with the Siberian Americans who had come in from the other side. So then they talk about how there's a parallel line of evidence coming from the Y chromosome. So we said at the very beginning how the mitochondrial DNA is only passed through the maternal lineage. Well, the Y chromosome only passed through the paternal lineage, so from males. And they show something similar, which is male genetic signatures associated with Europeans are very abundant in Northeast North America, in Native American samples there. So it seems to be the case that this supports their hypothesis also. Okay, so that's pretty much all I wanted to say with this paper. Again, the main takeaway is just that it's possible that Europeans were among the first to arrive in North America and that they contributed significantly to the peopling of the Americas. So again, the reason that this paper matters is because white people are treated as though we don't have a right to be in North America, or really anywhere for that matter. But evidence like this shows that even back tens of thousands of years ago, people with European ancestry were migrating and colonizing uninhabited areas. So, there's no reason, and other populations were doing the same thing. So there's no reason that we should be singled out as though we are uniquely bad and undeserving of our countries because we moved into areas. Okay, so it just provides a little more insight into who Native Americans actually were and their relationship with Europeans. So thank you for listening.